Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's lovely to see you all here this evening. And I'm going to talk about an incident which happened half a century ago yesterday. It's not often you can remember so clearly an event that happened 50 years ago. So tonight I shall be recalling something which still remains quite clear in my mind. As was my custom then, I used to spend my Monday evenings with my aunt in her house just off of Dare Walk, where I and my family would meet to have dinner. And we continue that custom even down to today. 50 years later, my family meets every Monday evening. Now, I should tell you, I am this handsome man at the back, in case you don't recognize me. There is my younger brother, Morris, by 15 minutes. There's my father, my sister, Pam. I don't know who that man is. I think he came in to read the meter. But there we are, gathered together. And my aunt, I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong way. My aunt, Sis, she was called because she was the eldest sister, was the kindest, sweetest, loveliest lady you could ever hope to meet. And she was an excellent cook. Every Monday we had shepherd's pie followed by trifle. It was the best meal of the week. And then we would settle down to watch television. And in those days we would watch Kojak. And once Kojak had solved his crime and put his lollipop in his mouth, it was time for me to go. I'd bid farewell to my family, I'd mount my trusty motorcycle, and I would go home. But on this evening, I had a difficult journey, because as I went down Liam Court Road, the traffic was bumper to bumper. And then as I turned into Streatham High Road, the traffic was almost stationary. But I was on a motorbike, so I could weave through the traffic as motorcyclists do. And when I got down by Sunny Hill Road, the road was blocked. The police were diverting the traffic down Sunny Hill Road. And rather than do that tour on my way home, I just wheeled my bike onto the pavement and walked down the high road. And I saw in the distance this red, throbbing glow around where St Leonard's Church was. And we have, very fortunately, got a remarkable set of pictures of the fire, taken by several neighbours who came out with their cameras to record the incident. And you can see from these photographs that the church was well ablaze and the fire had definitely taken hold by the time I was passing at about 9:30, 10 o'clock. The flames were leaping from the church high into the midnight sky, and although the firemen were there and they were playing their hoses onto the blaze, it was having really very little effect on the conflagration. And you can see from these pictures a comparatively lack of smoke, because all the timber in the church, the pews, the gallery, the rafters and so on, they were all dry wood, 200 years dry. And so once they caught light, they really did go at a tremendous blaze. And we're very grateful for 2 or 3 neighbours who very kindly took these pictures for us. But it gives you a very good indication as to the state and the size of the fire. The next morning, I got on my bike to go to work, and I passed the smouldering embers of the church, and there were still some firemen around the site, rolling up their hoses, tidying up at 7:30, 8 o'clock the following morning. That afternoon, I purchased a copy of the Evening Standard, and there was a full-page feature in the Standard on the fire, which was simply headed, "Centuries of History Vanish in Church Fire." The next day, the 8th of May, on the front page of the Times, no less, there was this photograph of the remains of St Leonard's Church, again captioned, "The historic St Leonard's Church, Streatham, gutted by fire on Monday night." The next day, the 8th of May, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the recently elected leader of the Conservative Party, who had only been in post just a few weeks, wrote a personal letter to the rector, and I'll read it out for you. Bill Shelton told me about the appalling fire in your church last week. And indeed, I saw the photograph on the front page of the Times. I am so sorry, but what a blessing that there was no loss of life. Bill Shelton tells me of your determination to rebuild the church and of the support that you are already receiving from the community. You have my very best wishes in your task. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher. Bill Shelton at that time was Streatham's MP, and he had played a key role in Mrs. Thatcher's election campaign to be leader of the Conservative Party and was subsequently her parliamentary private secretary. On the very next day, Friday the 9th of May, the tragedy filled the pages of the Streatham News. And on the inside page were these emotive pictures, and I think the picture on the right sums up the feeling locally. It shows the then rector, the Reverend Michael Hamilton Sharp, cloaked in his familiar black cape, standing forlorn amid the ruins of his church. It just illustrated perfectly the sorrow and distress experienced throughout the local community. Immediately after the fire, the future of St Leonard's Church must have seemed quite bleak. Old plans to create a roundabout encircling the church were resurrected, but quickly brushed aside by the rector, who announced that the church would be rebuilt and we start rebuilding tomorrow. However, he had no authority from the bishop or the church authorities to make that statement. Nonetheless, that is what he said. Here is the official report from the fire brigade, which shows that the cause of the fire remains unknown. And it still remains unknown, according to the fire brigade, today, 50 years later. However, ... Earlier that evening, there had been a grass fire on the open land, which is now known as the glebe, and the fire brigade was summoned to put that fire out, which they did. And I think it is highly likely that embers from that fire got lodged in the roof of the church, and over the ensuing 2 or 3 hours, they gradually got a hold in the dry timbers of the roof and started the blaze. This was spotted early that evening by a resident of St Mary's Convent, which is located opposite the church in Tootingbeck Gardens. She phoned the fire brigade, but unfortunately, by the time they arrived, the fire had taken its hold and the flames were leaping from the church high into the night sky. Despite the firemen fighting the blaze well into the early hours of the morning, all that was left standing the next day was the tower and the outer walls of the building. That morning, as smoke still hung heavy over the remains of the gutted church, the rector held a communion service in the graveyard using one of the tombs as an altar. The damage to the church building was almost total, with only a very small area of the south porch unaffected other than by serious smoke damage. These photographs show the extent of the destruction, with the woodwork and roof completely consumed by the fire. Most of the monuments and memorials were smashed to pieces as they fell from the walls onto the floor, and the stained glass windows were blown out by the heat and the force of the flames. The intensity of the flames had caused large areas of the plaster to fall away from the walls, leaving just the broken bones of brickwork of the outer walls of the building standing the following day. Fortunately, the church had been insured, and through the dedication and hard work of the rector, supported by the church wardens, the church council, the congregation and members of the parish, a new era began for St Leonard's. A new church was constructed within the outer walls of the old building to the designs of the local architects, the Douglas Feast Partnership. Douglas lived at 11A Streatham Common South and was a worshipping member here at St Leonard's. He, his associate David Roberts, and the rector shared a vision for the new church which rose like a phoenix from the ashes of the old building and enabled the work of St Leonard's to continue on into a new millennium. Most of the day-to-day decisions concerning the rebuilding were taken by a small committee consisting of the rector and his two church wardens, Charles Gibson and Andrew Hicks. It is principally to these three men we owe a great debt of gratitude, for without their hard work, dedication, and devotion, St Leonard's Church would probably be around about today. There is one other person whom I would like to mention in connection with the restoration of St Leonard's Church. She is often overlooked. She was Danish, she was 80 years old, and her name was Inger Norholt. It was she who repaired and renovated and reconstructed all the monuments and stonework in the church. These were packed up and sent to St Andrew's Church, which you can see in the top right-hand corner, where on a scaffolding platform in the side aisle, they were all laid out, and Inger set about putting all the pieces back together again. This was definitely a very painstaking exercise, and I am very fortunate to have met Inger, and I was very, very impressed by her dedication to the task. What entered St Andrews as a pile of rubble left as the wonderfully restored monuments we see today. While the church was being rebuilt, services were held in the church hall. Part of the ancient metal supports of the old Jacobean pulpit from the old church, dating back to the 1600s, was rescued for the ashes and used as a cross for these services, and you can see it here on the wall above the altar. And we still have that cross in the archives today. One would have thought that congregations would have dwindled during this period, but they didn't. They steadily increased. And so it was that on the 22nd of December 1976, the new rebuilt church was rededicated by the Bishop of Southwark. And by May of the following year, regular services were once again being held in the building, just 2 years after the devastating fire. Although the church was back in use for worship, there was still a tremendous amount of work to be undertaken. And it wasn't for another 10 years that the rebuilding and restoration of the church was completed, with the installation of new stained glass windows and the recasting of the bells taking place in the 1980s. I knew the old St Leonard's Church quite well, and my impressions of the building at that time was that it was a large, dark place with deep brown pews and with most of its windows glazed with heavy Victorian stained glass. The chancel was partly concealed from view by a large wooden rood screen, and the walls were completely covered with ancient monuments, some dating back many hundreds of years. All of these things added to the sense of darkness and enclosure of the old church building. What a difference to the St Leonards of today, with its bright white surroundings and sense of space and light. The fire was undoubtedly a major disaster, but the rebuilding was an opportunity which was seized upon to create a new church, blending the best of the old with the new. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the chancel, which was originally designed by the famous Victorian artist William Dyce. This now provides St Leonard's with a marvellous cathedral-like space of apparently great antiquity, much enhanced by the inspired decision to place the 14th century effigy of Sir John Ward beneath a canopy of similar date at the west end of the church. Today, 50 years after the fire, St Leonard's has risen from the ashes to become a strong, thriving church, proud of its inclusivity and the vibrant role it plays in the daily life of Streatham. The fire shows us that almost the total destruction of the building cannot destroy the spirit of the church, and it is the people who come and worship and serve here each week that are just as important as the bricks and mortar and the relics that surround them. Now, half a century after the fire, St Leonard's continues to stand at the very centre of our town, as it has for over 1,000 years, and it embraces the many challenges of its second millennium with great confidence, a strong faith, and a firm commitment to continue to serve the local community to the very best of its ability. Despite the fire, St Leonard's Church is still the oldest building in Streatham, with the tower dating back to the 1350s. This small Roman votive figure was discovered when digging the foundations of the Roman Catholic Church of the English Martyrs across the road, and it suggests that this area may have been the site of a Roman pagan shrine all those years ago. We know that there has been a place of Christian worship here since at least Saxon times, and a small chapel, valued at 40 pence, is recorded in the Domesday Survey of 1086. In 1066, the church has been dedicated to St Leonard, the patron saint of the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, on whose abbey the manors of Streatham and Tooting-Bec were endowed after the Norman conquest. As I say, the oldest part of the church is the tower, and the flint walls of this building are the same as they were in the 1350s. We have this earliest known view of St Leonard's, which dates from around about 1500. We also have this view showing the church in the 16th, early 17th century. This one is drawn by Holland Tringham, after whom the pub in the High Road is named. And he copied this picture from this ancient etching, which is in the London Metropolitan Archives. We have a number of views of the church in the late 1780s, which you can see here, and you can see that it was really quite a small building. And as time passed and the 19th century dawned, the church became too small to accommodate all the people who wanted to worship here. And so it was in 1831 that a major rebuilding of the church took place, and the architectural form of the current building was established. The present-day body of the church dates from this 1831 rebuilding, which incorporated many of the ancient monuments and fittings of the old church, and some of these have survived down to the present day. The church was further enlarged in 1863 when the chancel was added, which was designed by the famous Victorian artist William Doyce. However, all this was to be brushed away on the evening of the 5th of May when the fire completely gutted and destroyed the building. I thought for the remainder of my talk this evening, I would take you on a very brief tour of the building and show you some of the surviving ancient relics of the previous churches which have occupied this site, and some of the modern embellishments which make the current building such a wonderful combination of the old and the new. We will start with the tower. It is the oldest part of the church, and it is the oldest structure on the London to Brighton Road from Lambeth Palace to Croydon Palace. And if you want to see what the outside of the tower looked like originally, just go under the archway in the narthex, and by the staircase there is the original outer wall of the tower, and the mortar is so friable you can pick it away with your fingers, but please don't, otherwise it might fall down. The tower, of course, houses the spiral staircase. It is the oldest staircase in Streatham, built in 1370, and the floor of the steps have been worn away over 700 years, that we've had to cap them in wood so that you can climb them safely up to the belfry. Sitting atop of the tower used to be a wooden steeple, and we can see it in this picture. Several times over the centuries it was hit by lightning, the last time in 1841 when it was completely destroyed by fire, and so they built and constructed a new steeple. And we can see it here in this etching of the 1850s. It was covered in Roman cement so that it blended perfectly with the new 1831 church. After the fire, a new spire was added to the church, and this is the one that is still atop of the church building today. When you arrived this evening, you may not have noticed that you walked through these wonderful wrought iron gates. They were made by the village blacksmith in 1831, Thomas Street, and you can see him here hard at work at the forge, which used to be where the estate agents is opposite the church today. Probably the most magnificent thing in the tower that we have is the wonderful stained glass window. This window was made from all the broken bits of coloured glass that were rescued from the ashes of the fire as the debris was sifted after that event. The main part of the window comprises of a large circle depicting on the left the arms of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and on the right those of the Diocese of Southwark, to which St Leonard's has belonged since 1905. And above the roundel are two more coats of arms. On the left is that of Rochester, the Diocese of Rochester, which St Leonard's belonged to from 1877 to 1905. And on the right is Winchester, where St Leonard's was part of that diocese from ancient times to 1877. Those two coats of arms remained intact after the fire and were rescued from the east window and placed in the tower. At the top of the window is a white dove signifying the Holy Spirit, and that too was rescued from the old window and repositioned, as was, surprisingly, the head of St Benedict. People ask, why do we have the head of St Benedict in St Leonard's and we don't have the head of St Leonard's? Well, sadly, the head of St Leonard's was destroyed in the fire, and it was only St Benedict's head which remained. And St Benedict, of course, founded the great monastic order of Benedictine monks, after which the Abbey of Bec was a member. And as the Abbey of Bec had the manors of Tooting and Streatham endowed upon them, that is the reason that we had St Benedict in one of our old church windows. And we can see here a picture of the old Abbey of Bec in Normandy. On the north wall of the tower is a wonderful monument to a gentleman called John Massingberd and his wife Cecilia. John Massingberd lived in a large house opposite Tooting Bec Underground Station, still in the parish of Streatham in those days, and he was the treasurer of the East India Company. Streatham has a number of connections with East India tradesmen, one of whom was also John Howland. And his monument is on the other side of the tower wall and is probably the most grand monument you are likely to see in a South London church. It was erected in 1686. As Lord of the Manor, he lived in the old manor house, which was next to Streatham Common, opposite the present-day leisure centre, and it was here that on 3 occasions Queen Elizabeth made an official visit during her reign. In 1679, John Howland had inherited the manor from his father, and he lived at the manor house with his wife Elizabeth and their only daughter. She was the only daughter of Sir Josiah Child, who was chairman of the East India Company. Tragedy hit the family in 1686 when John Howland died, leaving his wife Elizabeth with their young daughter and the responsibility of administering her husband's vast business and manorial responsibilities. There is no doubt that Elizabeth was grief-stricken over the death of her husband, and this is evident in this magnificent monument, which is by that great 17th century sculptor, John Nost. And you can see from the cherubs, the swathes of cloth, and the other features of the monument how beautifully it has been carved. At the base of the monument is a cartouche with a legend about her husband, and there is a space on which her memorial was to be added when she died. But for some reason, although she was buried here in the church, her eulogy was not added to the monument. Also in the tower, we have the bells of St Leonard's, which have rung out over Streatham since at least the middle of the 14th century, when the existing bell tower was built. The earliest mention of bells at this church occurs in 1547, the first year of the reign of King Edward IV. Later in the 16th century, the 3 bells in the tower were increased in number to 5, the event being commemorated by the name of an old local inn opposite Streatham Green called the 5 Bells. And up in the belfry, now obscured from view, we can see the graffiti where somebody has carved their name, Edward Denman, 1774, and Edmund Denman was the son of the publican of the 5 Bells. In 1704, Elizabeth Howland paid 50p to the ringers of Streatham for a peal to be rung to celebrate the anniversary of the quenching of the plot by Guy Fawkes to blow up the Tower of London. The Houses of Parliament, beg your pardon. All our bells here are cast by William Mears at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, and in 1785, the Duke of Bedford gave a 6th bell on the condition that it was the bell used to toll the hour, so that every hour the residents of Streatham will be reminded that he is Lord of the Manor. And I understand that we still toll the hour on that bell today. The bells have been rung on a number of special occasions. In 1805, they were rung to celebrate Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. And in 1820, the bell ringers were provided with 4 gallons of beer, 16 loaves of bread, and 6 pounds of cheese to sustain them during the ringing on the coronation of King George IV. The present set of bells were cast at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in 1980 and 1981, and they were hung by volunteers in October of that year. And we can see in this picture a very young bell captain there, Mr. Nunn, and he is with us this evening. And if I show you the next picture, you can see a very old Mr. Nunn. Sorry, Tony. Ringing the bells. We do have here a very good team of bell ringers, and on the day before the fire, they did ring a peal of Grandsire triples, I think it was it Tony? A quarter peal, and we tried to replicate that yesterday. It took 45 minutes and we almost achieved it. Outside the church, for many centuries, there used to be this sundial so that local villagers would know the time. We don't know when we first had a clock because our records only go back to 1721, but we do know that at that time a clock was in existence. And in fact, this was replaced in 1779 when a new clock was built for us by Charles Penton of Moorfields. And that clock is still telling the time today. Here's a picture of it after the fire. We know when the fire reached the tower because the clock stopped at 10 to 7. And you wouldn't have thought it was possible to repair that clock. But here it is, repaired and still in work over 250 years since it was originally made all those years ago in 1779. Adjoining the tower, we have the Chapel of Unity. And the cost of refurbishing this chapel was met by all the different churches in Streatham who made a contribution towards its cost. The oldest brass in the church is that to a former rector, John Elselfield, and this is on the floor of the chapel by the altar. And we don't know its date, but he was instigated here in 1390, so I would guess probably 1410, 1420, something of that age. On one wall, we have the memorial to 2 wives of a gentleman called John Bockett. His first wife was buried in the crypt of this church, and so he chose to be buried with his second wife in the graveyard, and that's his tomb. Also, I should mention that his monument gives us an idea of how large Streatham Parish used to be, because he used to live in the parish in a large house called Westbury, on which Clapham South Underground Station stands today. And technically, Clapham South Station should be called Streatham Station because it's in the old parish of Streatham. But one of our most important national monuments is also in the Chapel of Unity, and it is to Edmund Tilney, Master of the Revels to Queen Elizabeth I and King James I, who was buried here in 1610. An image of Edmund is depicted in the Streatham window, and his importance is that as Master of the Revels, he was the gentleman who censored the plays of William Shakespeare. It has been suggested that he was a vain and ambitious man because around his monument are a huge number of coats of arms, none of which are his. They are all his distant relatives. And 3/4 of his monument lists all the very important people he is related to. However, one of those people who he was most closest related to is not mentioned, and that is Catherine Howard. Catherine was the fifth wife of Henry VIII, and no doubt she is not mentioned because she had her head chopped off for committing adultery with Thomas Culpeper, among others, including, believe it or not, a chap called Henry Manox of Streatham. Edmund Tilney's mother, Maylin Tilney, was lady-in-waiting to the Queen and was implicated in the scandal. No doubt she sneaked Henry Manox up to the Queen's bedchamber, and so she was imprisoned in the Tower of London. However, she kept her head, but she lost all her goods and possessions. Tilney had the monument made during his lifetime, and therefore he couldn't add to it the date of his death. So when he died, he left no money in his will to have the date of his death added, and so today the space is there because nobody was prepared to pay to add those 4 characters, 1610. An interesting connection with Edmund Tilney is in the film Shakespeare in Love, because in that film, Simon Callow played the role of Edmund Tilney, and strangely, Simon Callow was born in Streatham and lived here during the days of his youth. But there's one other monument in the Chapel of Unity I want to show you, and it is this one, and it is to Rebecca Lynn. It was put up during the time of the Cromwellian period, a period of great austerity and Protestant faith. But it has a wonderful epitaph, and those married men present might want to get out your pen and paper and make a note of this, in case you may want to use it. The final 2 verses of this monument reads, "Should I 10,000 years enjoy my life, I could not praise enough so good a wife." Now, the nave is the main body of the church between the entrance and the chancel, the area around the altar. And we now have this wonderful wide open space because we don't have pews anymore, but chairs. And down by the steps just in front of me is a black slab which marks the site of the original altar in the old St Leonard's church. By the entrance, we have the font, which was very badly damaged during the fire. It dates from 1538, and you can see the extent of the damage as the roof rafters smashed onto it on that night of the 5th of May. It was decided not to repair the font as it was, but to keep the old 14th century bowl and to place it on a pedestal that used to be in the church at that time, so that we have a complete replica of the original font. Another tragedy, of course, was the lectern. I'm not preaching from a pulpit, but from the lectern, which was the gift of St Leonard's School. And on the front of the lectern, you will see the chains and manacles of prisoners, because St Leonard is the patron saint of prisoners. The old pulpit was a very impressive Jacobean piece of carpentry. On its side were the coat of arms of the Howland and Swan families, because John Howland had married Cecilia Swan, and the pulpit was his gift to the church. At a later date, it became a double-decker pulpit, and there was a reading desk at the bottom, and it was draped with velvet cloth. And in the parish accounts, there are several mentions of stuffing the rector's cushion in velvet so that he could sit down during the service on a comfortable pew. Running either side of the central part of the church are a number of memorials in the floor, and an interesting one is to Thomas Holt, who was rector here between 1688 and 1710, and he was the grandfather of the naturalist Gilbert White, author of The Natural History of Selborne. Thomas Holt died in 1710. Another notable rector here was Herbert Hill. Herbert Hill died in 1828, aged 79. He was a former chaplain of the British community in Lisbon, and he came to this church in the early 1800s. He was the favourite uncle of the poet laureate Robert Southey, and Robert Southey occasionally came to Streatham to stay with his uncle, and his uncle married late in life and had 8 children and lived in a state of gentle confusion as all these children ran around the rectory. And so Robert Southey wrote a fairy story for his children, and that story was Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Now, Herbert Hill had married a young lady in her 30s, although he was in his 60s. And she had a friend who was very concerned about her and her new husband. She needn't have been, because as I say, they had 8 or 9 children. But she would come to Streatham to visit her friend. Her friend was Catherine Bigwither, and she was Jane Austen. And she came and stayed at the rectory on a number of occasions, and you may remember our last talk when we examined the life and works of Jane Austen. The chancel is this area around the altar of the church. And because of the inspired decision to make it open and to make it a space of apparent antiquity after the fire, we are blessed with a lovely area for worship and for use on other occasions. Originally, there was just a very small, what is known as an apse at this end of the church, which really only took you back to where the screen is here this evening. But again, as the population steadily increased, the church had to be extended, and the original designs for this was by William Dyce. And because of the fire, we have a lot of damaged stonework around the building that we haven't been able to repair. And this, of course, adds to the sense of antiquity in this part of the church. But of course, really, this is the newest part of the church behind me, because this dates from the 1860s, where the area in which you're sitting tonight dates from the 1830s. We have a wonderful altar which was made by Orcas in Mitcham Lane, and the frontal for the altar was made and presented to the church by David Roberts and his wife, who was a co-architect on the rebuilding of the church. And of course, we have this magnificent stained glass window by John Hayward. John Hayward lived in Streatham. He is responsible for about 200 or over 200 stained glass windows in churches all over this country and in cathedrals. And he did this particular window using a technique dating from the 14th century, where the glass is covered by a silver shade on the back of the glass to enable as much light to come through as possible. And it depicts in the central lancet Christ, and then we have the 4 images of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And because of the way the window has been constructed and the materials used, we have maintained this wonderful sense of light and openness in the church. And because the technique here dates from the 14th century, it's rather nice that beneath the window is the 14th century effigy of Sir John Ward, who was responsible for rebuilding this church. He fought with the Black Prince in the French wars in the 1350s, and it is thought that he paid to have the church rebuilt, either as a thanks offering for his safe return from the war, or for the deliverance of Streatham from the plague, both events happening at that time. Originally, as you can see, he was complete with his arms and his legs, but I believe that they were lost when lightning hit the tower in 1771 and smashed to pieces. And so the remnant that we see today is all that survives. For many years, people said that the monument had been destroyed or damaged by Cromwellian soldiers during the Civil War. But we know that's not the case because we've got pictures of the effigy undamaged in the early 1700s, well after the end of the Civil War. So I think that the suggestion I make about lightning is probably the true one. We also have a lovely brass to a former rector of the church, William Malfirth, who died in 1513. And this is up on the wall behind me. And during the 1970s and 80s, lots of people would come to this church to do brass rubbing. And that is why we lifted the brass, in this instance, off of the floor and put it on the wall. To my left, your right, is the Lady Chapel. And before the fire, this was a small place where people could gather in small numbers to worship. And we have a wonderful relic today in the Lady Chapel of the fire in the Black Madonna. This particular effigy used to adorn the rood screen. But in the fire, the rood screen made of wood was completely destroyed, and the next day, the charred remains of the Virgin Mary were found, and we decided to keep them as a memento of the fire, and so today they are in the Lady Chapel, one of the relics of the fire. And of course, we have another window there by John Haywood, showing the gospel story, and the central part tells of the Christmas story and has been used on a number of occasions as a Christmas card. And on the wall, we have this wonderful brass. It's the oldest of the brasses in the church, dated 1598, and was put up by Gabriel Livesey in memory of his wife Anne, who died at the age of 20 in childbirth. Gabriel Livesey subsequently moved to East Church in Kent, and we can see his magnificent monument in that church here. Gabriel, on moving to East Church, married for a second time, and he and his second wife had a son. And his son was called Michael, and he became a baronet in 1627 at the early age of 17. And he was a staunch Republican. It was he, during the reign of King Charles I, who played a prominent role in the Cromwellian movement. He was a judge at King Charles's trial, and he was one of those who signed the king's death warrant for his execution. Gabriel Livesey left a generous legacy to St Leonard's Church in his will, and part of his legacy were buildings in Tooting, which included the Bell Public House, which we see here. It is interesting to note that it was while the church owned this pub that at Christmas 1824, the licensee was taken to court for running a disorderly house. In other words, a brothel. So on the revelation that St Leonard's Church not only owned a pub, but ran a brothel, I think it is time for us to pause for tea. But before doing so, I would draw your attention to the exhibition behind me and also to the church guide. Now, I know what you're thinking. I can feel it. I could never afford to pay £25 for a guide like that. But we're not asking £25 tonight. We're not asking £20, £50, not even £10. Tonight, it can be yours for the trivial sum of £7.50. And please rush to the bookstall afterwards, because we've only got 2,500 copies left for sale. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if we could just gather again.
Please all start getting to sit down or either go or wait for us for the second half.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Yes. Just mind how you go in the dark. Well, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to briefly continue our tour for the next 15 minutes or so, and we're going to start in the North Chapel, because before the 1975 fire, this was a large room used as a clergy vestry or sacristy, where the clergy kept their robes and vestments, and also the organ was housed here. But after the fire, it was decided that the area should be kept open and we should have this wonderful space. And so the clergy vestry was moved upstairs, and the organ, as you can see, is behind you in the gallery. The chapel contains 3 nationally important monuments to members of the Thrale family. The first is that in memory of Henry Thrale, the famous Southwark brewer. He died in 1781 at the age of 52. On the death of his father, he inherited the family brewery in Southwark, and that business was to become the 4th largest brewery in London. Henry was also elected as MP for Southwark, the constituency in which his brewery was located. Henry also inherited from his father the magnificent country mansion at Streatham Park, which his father purchased in 1735 and which Henry subsequently extended and enlarged. It was at Streatham Park that Henry and his wife Hester entertained the leading luminaries of the late 18th century, including such famous men as David Garrick, Edmund Burke, Oliver Goldsmith, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and of course, Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century lexicographer and author. Johnson was a frequent visitor to Streatham Park between 1766 and 1782, and would often spend the middle part of the week there as the Thrales' house guest. He had a room in the house reserved for him, and in the summer months, he would while away the time writing in this rather unique summer house in the grounds of Streatham Park. Henry Thrale died in 1781 after suffering a series of apoplectic fits. And as a condition, he found that he had no control over his eating, and he would eat enormous meals, washed down with literally gallons of strong beer from his brewery. So much so that if you go down into the crypt today, you can see the largest coffin you've ever seen, which is the remains of Henry Thrale, which is laid to rest beneath us in the crypt at St Leonard's Church. Following his death, Dr. Samuel Johnson assisted in the sale of the brewery, and when asked what he thought the value of the business was, remembering, of course, it was the 4th largest brewery in London, he replied, "We are not here to sell a parcel of boilers and vats, but the potentiality of growing rich beyond the dreams of avarice." And I think that gives you an idea of just how wealthy Henry Thrale was. Sadly, after Henry's death, the relationship between Hester Thrale, his widow, and Dr. Johnson cooled, especially after Hester subsequently married her daughter's Italian music teacher, Gabriele Piozzi. In 1782, Samuel Johnson made his last visit to Streatham Park, and with a heavy heart wrote in his diary later that evening, "Sunday, went to church at Streatham. I bade farewell to the church with a kiss." Henry Thrale's monument was cut by the famous sculptor John Flaxman, and the Latin inscription was composed by Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson wrote only 4 epitaphs in his life. One, intended for Hogarth's tomb, was never used, and he wrote the other for Oliver Goldsmith, the great novelist, poet, and playwright. The third he wrote in memory of Henry Thrale's mother-in-law, and the fourth was for Henry Thrale himself. So we here in Streatham have 2 monuments whose eulogies were written by the great author Dr. Johnson. The central of the 3 monuments is to Henry Thrale's daughter, Sophia Hoare. She married into the famous banking family. Although Henry and Hester Thrale had about 12 children, only 4 daughters survived into adulthood. Sophia's monument was carved by Flaxman, and it is said that when you look at it, those people who saw it could identify each of her 3 sisters from the carvings made by Flaxman. And here we see the 3 sisters. There we see her husband mourning her loss, and the angel heralding her soul up to heaven. After her death, her widower and her 3 sisters put money together to fund the building of the Thrale almshouses. And these almshouses stood in Streatham High Road, and they were erected in memory of their parents, Henry and Hester Thrale, and the accommodation was available for 4 poor widows or single women who had attained an honest old age in Streatham. And they survive today in Polwarth Road, and their number is now 17, and I believe the criteria is exactly the same for those 17 women. They have to be over 80-60, and they have to have attained their old age by honest practices. Next to Sophia's memorial is that to Hester Maria Salisbury, who was Henry Thrale's mother-in-law. Again, it is by Flaxman, and Dr. Johnson, as I said earlier, wrote the epitaph. Now, this monument, together with the previous 2 I've spoken about, were repaired after the fire by Inge Norholt, and part of the money for their restitution came from the Johnson Society. On the floor of the chapel, there is the gravestone for Susanna Thrale. She was originally buried in the graveyard, but after the fire, it was decided to bring her tombstone into the church so that all the monuments are kept together. And of course, one of the treasures of the North Chapel is the Streatham window. It depicts the history of Streatham through various images created by John Hayward, and it was erected in 1980 in memory of Ronnie and Connie Measures, who were 2 members of the congregation here. I'll briefly go through the window for you because it is a potted history, really, of Streatham. In the top roundel, we can see in the middle the letters S and L for St Leonard, and again the manacled chains reminding us that he was the patron saint of prisoners. And then we have the coats of arms of the Diocese of Winchester, Rochester and Southwark, to which this church has belonged or does belong today. In the top left-hand corner of the window, we have the replication of the Roman coins found when the foundations for the 1831 church was being dug, reminding us of the Roman heritage of Streatham. They date from the late 3rd century. Going down the window, we next come to the Abbot of Chertsey and his coat of arms, because the Abbot of Chertsey held the manors of Tooting and Streatham in 675. Then next we have St Anselm, who was the Abbot of Bec, and as I mentioned earlier, the Abbot of Bec had the lordship of the manors bestowed on them after the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror gave the manors to Richard Fitzgilbert, Lord of Clare, who endowed them on the abbey for the preservation of his soul. They also have this wonderful image of Sir John Ward, who I spoke about earlier, and you can see that on his lap is a replica or an image of what we think the church was that he rebuilt in 1370. And below him we have these Eton lilies, which are part of the armoury bear's arms for Eton College, who again briefly held the manor of Streatham and Tooting Bec as a gift from Henry VI in 1442. Next to them we have a very interesting depiction of the Brabourne incident in 1394. In 1394, John Brabourne had stolen from his master, and he ran up Streatham High Road and he broke into the church and claimed sanctuary. However, his master was not going to let him get away with robbery, so he sent 3 of his workmen in who dragged John Brabourne out of the church and took him off to Guildford prison. However, when Richard II heard that the sanctuary of the church had been violated, he ordered John Brabourne to be released, and he ordered that the 3 men be whipped by the rector down Streatham High Road on 3 consecutive Sundays, after which their bloodied bodies were to be placed in the church and they were to repent for their sins. Rough justice in those days. Then opposite that, we have this wonderful representation of Edmund Tilney, whom I spoke about earlier. The Thrales unquestionably put Streatham on the map in the late 18th century, and so it is their image and the image of their house at Streatham Park, which is the next part of the Streatham window. And beneath them, of course, we have Dr. Johnson, the famous writer, and James Boswell, his biographer. And we also have there a remembrance of the Thrale coat of arms, or it's really the Thrale badge, because they didn't have a coat of arms, and a replica of the church at the time they were living here in Streatham. The Howland family, whose monument is in the tower, are represented in the window by this wonderful image of John Howland, and again his coat of arms, beneath which are the coat of arms of the Duke of Bedford. It was John Howland's 13-year-old daughter that married the 12-year-old Marquess of Tavistock, who was the oldest son of the Duke of Bedford, that brought the manor of Streatham and Tooting Bec into the ownership of the Dukes of Bedford. And that's why in Streatham you've got Russell's Footpath, Russell being the name of the Bedford family, you've got Bedford Hill, and you've got all these reminders of the Bedford family. And then beneath that we have this wonderful round wall showing 11 of the 16 daughter churches of St Leonard's. St Leonard's was a large parish. It included Knight's Hill, Tooting Bec, Balham. It was huge. And during the 19th century, it was carved up into 16 parishes. And 11 of these are featured in the window, and we can see them here. We have St Peter's at the top. We have St James in Mitcham Lane, the Holy Redeemer in Streatham Vale, St Andrew's, which used to be in Gildersfield Road, Christ Church at Streatham Hill. I can't quite read that one. What does that one say there? Just excuse me for a moment. Oh, that's St Peter's Church. This is St James's in Mitcham Hill. That's St Margaret's in Streatham Hill, and then Demang. Sorry, it's very difficult seeing these pictures at an angle. But it gives you an idea, does it not, of just how very large the parish was. And then, of course, we have the memorial plaque to Ronnie and Connie Measures. The window was erected in 1980 in memory of Ronnie, who had died, and then in 1985 the dedication was changed to include his widow. Also, at the bottom of the window, we have this replica of the Dice Fountain, built from public subscription to William Dice. Dice came to Streatham in the late 1850s and had his studio in part of Bedford House, which stood in Streatham High Road. He later moved to a large house at the junction of Liam Court Road and Streatham High Road, opposite Streatham Hill Station. Dice was a pioneer of the Pre-Raphaelite school of painting and a member of the Royal Academy. His work can be seen today in the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, and this image of Neptune surrendering the crown of the sea to Britannia is at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, on the stairway leading up to the royal bedchamber. In 2007 and 2017, his paintings of the Madonna and Child were used on the Christmas stamps, and he was also responsible for designing the obverse of the florin, the modern-day equivalent of which is the 10p coin. As previously mentioned, he designed the chancel extension in 1863. And it was whilst he was painting the murals in the Houses of Parliament that he was taken ill and brought back to his home here in Streatham, where he died a few days later and was buried on St Valentine's Day, 1684, and his grave is in our churchyard. Also in the window is the commemoration of Mervyn Stockwood, who was for over 20 years the Bishop of Southwark, and he actually lived just 200 yards away from where we are now in the Bishop's house in Tootingbeck Gardens. The next image I'm going to show you I think is really quite emotive, and it is John Hayward's interpretation of the fire which engulfed the church on the 5th of May 1975. And in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see the architectural motif for Douglas Feast, who was responsible for designing the new church, and opposite that, an image of Michael Hamilton Sharp, who was responsible and the motivating force for rebuilding the church at that time. John Howard, a local man, is responsible for all the stained glass in this church, and I think it's quite remarkable that when you look at it, it's all of various different styles, and yet he's captured quite wonderfully the messages that he wanted to put across. Well, thank you very much indeed this evening. I've only been able to give you a brief tour of the church, and how wonderful it is for me. I never thought I would say this 50 years ago, that half a century later, we are here to celebrate the rebuilding of this wonderful building, and that it continues its work to the people and residents of Streatham. Thank you very much indeed.